right, Dr. Matt O'Reilly, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Joe. Thanks for hosting this conversation. I'm looking forward to it and the chance to get to know you a little bit.
Yeah, so let me introduce you real quick. You are the lead pastor of Christ Church in Birmingham, Alabama, and you're the director of research at Wesley Biblical Seminary. I really like the work that Andy Miller's doing on his podcast from Wesley
Yep.
Biblical Seminary. Really
Yep.
good. Um, you're the author of multiple books, including Free to Be Holy, A Theology of Sanctification, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So let me just hold up a copy of that. Free to Be Holy. This is an uh, a fairly easy read and quick read. You can see like it's not a super thick book, and I really appreciate how concise um, you've presented this topic of sanctification, and I feel like you've packed as much punch as you can into as few words as possible to make it very approachable. A lot of books are so intimidating, and this is very approachable.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That one specifically, I think holiness is a scary topic for people anyway. And the idea was how can this be presented in such a way where it's not lacking theological rigor or biblical engagement, but isn't intimidating to hand to someone, you know.
Yeah.
That was the if it came across that way, then that was at least one success.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Yeah, you have some other projects that you're involved in, which we can talk more about as we wrap up a few of the projects that you're involved as far as the theology project, seedbed, things like that. But yeah, let's just jump into the book. There's two main questions that you ask in the book, and those are, what is holiness, and how holy can we expect to become in this life? And before we dive into those questions, I want to mention something that you wrote in the introduction. And you wrote, I was frustrated because so much of Christian teaching focused on the hope for the next life, but had little to say regarding hope for this life. And that really stood out to me because that's kind of how I felt. So I grew up in where we talked about holiness a lot. And I would say that at times that slipped into more of a legalist kind of mindset where uh, living holy was more about like securing our entrance into heaven. Like we live holy in order to make it to heaven, and it was less about the hope for this life. So yeah, um, I appreciated that thought there about holiness being hope for this life.
Yeah, no, that for me is a huge piece of it, and I think, and this may resonate with you a little bit. I think we're kind of at a period in American Christianity or Christianity in the West where you're hearing more about kind of post-Christian culture and things like that, where it's not a given. And I worry, and I would be honestly really interested to hear your thoughts on this. I worry that kind of the way that we've done the gospel, right, as in this transaction where you come down front, you pray the prayer, and then you go back to normal, and maybe you're supposed to be a better person or live a good life, but you'll never really be free from sin. Um, and it's a very truncated version of the gospel. And I think folks are just seeing through it, honestly. It's not compelling. It's not compelling to me, to tell you and I'm a pastor. That kind of truncated gospel, I find it thoroughly uninteresting. Um, but if if walking with God in Christ and the power of the Spirit is about, I had a conversation with one of my colleagues at Wesley Biblical Seminary yesterday, and he was sort of framing it up in terms of, for the Wesleyan tradition, I'm a Methodist pastor, Wesley Biblical Seminary, for the Wesleyan tradition, right? Salvation is not just forgiveness of sins; it's the restoration of the image of God. So we're made in the image of God. Um, we have rebelled against Him. The image has been corrupted, damaged, um, broken. It's not gone. It's not eradicated. It's not erased, but things are not as they should be, and they're very, very bad. In fact, I would go so far as to say we're worse than we think we are, right? And but looking upon that, God doesn't just sort of say, "Well, I'm done with you. No interest in this project anymore. You've betrayed me. You've sinned against me, and I'm just done with you." As opposed, instead of that, God enters into human experience in the one person of Jesus, who unites the divine nature and the human nature, draws our nature into union with His in order to restore His image to our nature. And then, if you're thinking about salvation, not primarily as a transaction where forgiveness is extended or a verdict where not guilty is declared, it is those things, but it's not just those things. The Wesleyan tradition would absolutely say, yes, that's a part of salvation. It's just not the whole of salvation. In fact, it's not even the end of salvation. It's not the point. It's a means to a greater end where we're restored, where the image of God that we were created with in the first place is returned to us. And that looks like healing. That looks like freedom. That looks like a life that is thoroughly transformed. It looks like a life that embodies love for God and love for neighbor. And so I think that's really the thing that attracts me to the Wesleyan tradition is that more holistic vision of salvation. That God isn't just trying. There is a verdict, yes, but the verdict is a means to an end of a thoroughgoing overhaul of my life. And the things that are being overhauled, that are being taken away, are the things that make it a mess.
Yeah, that's so good. I was listening to a lecture by Tom McCall where he talked about Christianity's um, uh, crisis of credibility.
Oh,
And
wow.
he
Yeah.
was saying that people from the outside and even on the inside um, are beginning to wonder. They're not seeing anything that's worth hoping is true, or they're not seeing anything that's attractive.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think on one side you have this idea that if we say the right prayer or place our faith in Jesus, then we're secure or safe at the end. We're going to struggle with sin, deal with sin in this life, but at least we're safe at the end. We make it to heaven. And then there's kind of more the legalistic end where we feel like we're trying to live holy in order to make it into heaven. And the way that you talk about holiness and the hope for this life, the freedom from sin in this life, to actually flourish and to be happy here and now, like to me, that's such an attractive message. And yeah, one that I, can look at and say, man, I hope that's true. And I'm willing to, I want to explore that with more curiosity.
I
And
hope it's true too.
yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah, so let's dive in with this first question. What is holiness?
Yeah. So I would want to say holiness when it comes to human beings has to do with the consistent embodiment of the character of God, right? So if you look at holiness language, particularly in the Old Testament, sometimes it's attributed to inanimate like instruments, like all of the furnishings of the temple are holy, right? And that doesn't have to do with their character because they're not alive. They're not people. Has to do with they're set aside for a certain purpose or use in the temple cult for the worship of the Hebrew people's God, for Yahweh. Um, and sometimes you'll read scholars and they'll say, well, that's what it means when it's used with regard to human beings too, right? It's this sort of status. It's a holy status, and it has to do with being set apart. And it's not primarily moral or ethical in that way. I would want to push back on that pretty hard and say, when the language of holiness is applied to human beings, Old Testament and New Testament, that it is very much moral and ethical in terms of its what it means, and it has to do with, but not moral ethical in like a legalistic kind of way. Moral ethical in the sense of the people of God are called to embody the character of God, and God's character is such that He's marked by other-oriented love. He is holy love, and he takes up uh, he regards the needs of others ahead of his own, to use the language of Philippians 2 in the incarnation with Jesus. And so when you start looking at in Exodus and Leviticus, when holiness language shows up, it frequently has to do with how you relate to other people, and it frequently has to do with not taking advantage of people who have some disadvantage in relation to you. Um, and and the rationale for that, those commands are substantiated, not because God just has this list of rules, right? So one of them, Leviticus 19, is part of the holiness code. One of my favorite ones is God says, "You shall be holy because I'm the Lord your God. I'm holy." Don't trip blind people, right? But don't put a stumbling block in front of the blind, right? Here's a person who has some physical handicap or disability. They can't see. You can see, and so they, relative to you, they have this disadvantage, and you can use your advantage or your power to harm them, or you can use it to defend them, to take up the case of the weak. And the logic of that whole passage isn't like I'm God and I've got a list of rules and you should just do them. The logic is, hey, when you were slaves, I took up your case. That's what my character looks like. And so now that you're free and you're my people, I want you to be the kind of people that I want you to be people who are like me, who share my character. And since I look upon lowly people like you, slaves in a land not your own, and I take up your case, I want you to be the kind of people who do that. So, pay your people on payday, honor your parents, don't worship idols, um, don't trip blind people. They don't make mean jokes about the deaf. They can't hear you. All those kinds of things. Again, not here's the list of rules where you tick them off to be accepted by me. It's now that you represent me, you must embody my character. I, the Lord your God, am holy. Therefore, you should be holy also. Therefore, here's how you engage with other people. So I would argue consistently there, that all through the vision is holiness, when used with regard to the people of God, has to do with embodying God's character, which is holy love.
Yeah. Yeah. When I think about this, I think I'm often thinking of um, my family. The more I lean into this, the more I begin to recognize, wow, these different ways where I'm maybe not showing them the love that I should be showing them. I feel motivated to love them better. But it extends so far beyond that. And you wrote that if we want to talk about holiness, we have to talk about perfect love. And loving our enemies is perfect love. So enemy love is the most extensive sort of love. So it goes way beyond those kind of easier things to think about. Like, yeah, I want to love my wife better. I want to love my kids better. Like, this is loving those who are not returning that, and we have nothing to receive back from them. Yeah, that would be like the most extensive forms of perfect love is
Yeah,
extending
yeah.
that to your enemies.
If I recall, that's in the chapter on the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, "Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect." And it's one of those passages where we're kind of like, can he be serious, right? Like, God's perfect. He's absolutely perfect. He's perfect in every way. What could that even mean? And so we just go on to the next verse because it's hard to take Jesus seriously there. But in context, right, he's instructing his followers to love their enemies. And and in the historical context, you're talking about Jews who were slaves in their own land with Roman soldiers posted on the corners of their streets. And you get Jesus, this rabbi going around saying, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And if you do that, you'll be like your Father in heaven. And so, even there, right, it's not this absolute perfection of unqualified. If you read John Wesley, he's got all of these ways we're not perfect, right? We're not free from mistake. We're not free from ignorance. We're not free from non moral imperfections, infirmities, not free from temptation, right? So, for Wesley, Christian perfection or perfect love or holiness, all of those are basically synonymous. None of that is this absolute, unqualified, divine perfection that only God has. Um, and in Matthew 5:48, when Jesus talks about the perfection of the Father, he has in mind love for people who don't return that love. It's funny that bit in particularly, I sort of made that argument, and then my editor at Seedbed, at the publisher, he said, "All right, that's fine. But how about the people who, this is why you need a good editor. He said, how about the people who, they go through their lives, middle class Americans, they don't really have enemies, they're not in places where they're persecuted. They're not slaves in their own land. What about them?" And that's when it really that question pushed me to think through, it's an argument from the most extreme case, right? So if I should love my enemy, I ought to be able to love my wife
Yeah,
with
yeah,
a perfect love.
yeah,
And so enemy love is this sort of argument from the greatest example. And if you can love your enemies, you ought to be able to love your neighbors.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. So there's this idea that like to be human is to fall short. It's to mess up. So like it sort of sounds like what Jesus is asking us to do is to go beyond human nature to something that uh, is beyond human. Like to be human is to sin. It is to fail. That's just what it means to be human.
Yeah.
How does this idea of holiness play into that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so it's really crucial there. And I think this goes back to in the evangelical tradition, we've spent so much time defending the deity of Christ against kind of Protestant liberalism that we forgot the humanity of Christ, I worry. And so a truly high Christology, a truly orthodox Christology, is that Jesus is fully divine and fully human. And that in the one person of Jesus, the human nature, full human nature and full divine nature are inseparably united. So that's an orthodox Christology. That means that Jesus is fully human. And what I would want to say is Jesus isn't suprahuman. He's not. He's not more. He's not just sort of human in appearance only. You know, the church rejected that very early on. This kind of docetic. He's just appears like one of us, but isn't really one of us. You know, the church has insisted Jesus is fully human, and so that means I would say so. If you want to ask me what does it mean to be human, I don't want to look at myself. I want to look at Jesus. Jesus tells me what it means to be a human being. If we're thinking about salvation as the restoration of the image of God, and full human life is a fully restored image, I want to look at Jesus because he embodies God. He bears the image uh, of God perfectly. He's the human being who bears the perfect image of God. And so, if we think about Jesus as the one who defines what it means to be human, um, yes, Scripture says all have fallen short with regard to us. Um, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, Romans 3, right? And it's thinking of our common human experience and rebellion. Every human being except Jesus, right? Um, but that doesn't mean all human beings have fallen short, right? It's all of us, all of fallen humanity, but not Jesus. Jesus was tempted in every way, but had never sinned. So you have a human being who has not sinned. And that means that sin is not essential to human nature. So what is it? I would say sin is a corruption of human nature. Sin degrades human nature. Sin drags us into subhuman existence. Sin drags us into non-existence. That's a very Athanasian side. So Saint Athanasius, in his work on the Incarnation, which is one of my favorite texts, I try to read it once a year, once every 2 years. He says, God is pure being, and he brings us into being. And when humanity sinned against God, we begin descending into non-being. But it was, he says something like, this is going to paraphrase him, but he says, but it's not fitting for the creatures made in the image of the living God to descend into non-being. It's not fitting for creatures made in the image of the God who is being to descend into non-being. And so God enters in, he takes human nature to himself in order to recover it and bring it back into full human being. So we need to think about sin not as essential to or the definition of human being, but as a degradation of human being. Sin is subhuman existence. Sin is destructive of our humanity. You mentioned Tom McCall. If in, I would encourage your listeners to read his book Against God and Nature, A Theology of Sin. It's the best treatment on this. And he goes through and argues again and again, sin is not nature, sin is against nature, right? When Paul writes about Romans 1:18 and following, it's the people who are in sin are doing what is contrary to nature, right? They're not indulging their nature, they're resisting their nature as creatures made in the image of God. The idolatry is contrary to nature. The sexual practices are contrary to nature. The sin is contrary to nature. So they take a posture of antagonism towards God because they commit idolatry. They give the glory that belongs only to the Creator to created things. And then they take a posture against their own human nature by engaging in practices that are contrary to human nature. And so in Romans, for Paul, and I would say the whole Bible, sin is it is a posture of antagonism against God and human nature. And so if sin is contrary to nature, if sin is a degradation of human nature, then holiness becomes the fullness of human being, right? So sanctification is the process of becoming fully human, because sanctification is the process of being conformed to Jesus Christ, and Jesus is the fully human one.
Yeah, this is where this concept of holiness just starts to become so attractive to me. So I know we're talking about uh holy or human nature and holiness in kind of a broad general sense, but when I'm reading your book, I'm hearing it in a more personal sense, like what God is trying to do in my life or the work that he's doing in my life is to make me more fully me. Um, so the way that I kind of experienced holiness growing up was that, you know, I was sinful. God was just disappointed in me, just kind of tolerated my presence, didn't really want me, just sort of expected this robotic shell of a person. And if he could eliminate all of me, then he'd be happy to be left with this sort of shell of a person that was even no longer me. And the way that you're talking about this makes it sound like it's actually the complete opposite. Like God is trying, or God is working in me to eliminate all that is not me, uh,
Yeah.
so that holiness is more about becoming more of who I am as a human being, living more fully into what it means to be human. And it's just, yeah, it's a complete different mindset where formerly it just felt like God didn't want me. And now it feels like, no, like you are who God wants. And he's working in your life to eliminate these things that are preventing you from being
Yeah.
fully human.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, the way you're talking there makes me think of the text that says, "You knit me together in my mother's womb," right? So there's this God is depicted in scripture as being like deeply, deeply engaged and deeply intentional about the creation of each individual made in his image. And he has this vision for full humanness, right? And and sin wars against God's intent in knitting you together in your mother's womb. God's intent for your full human flourishing. Sin wars against your flourishing. Sin wars against your humanity. C.S. Lewis is really good about this, right? In The Great Divorce, people, every, like heaven is more real and hell is gray and dull, right?
Right.
And so there's two things where the folks who refuse to go, if listeners are familiar with the Great Divorce, if not, read it because it's great. Um, as the travelers approach the heavenly city, things get more solid and more real. And then the ones who refuse to keep going towards the heavenly city, as they move away from it, they become less themselves. They become shriveled and they become translucent, right? And there's this one bit where the main character, gets off the bus, right? Because he's Lewis is from England, and buses are a big part of life. So if you're going to have a story about going from hell to heaven, it would be on a bus, right? So they get off the bus, and he steps on the grass, and it hurts his feet. You may remember this passage, and and the character looks down and he sees that he can kind of see through his foot. It's kind of shadowy, almost ghost-like, and he can see, and the blades of grass below it are really solid and sharp. And so as his sort of translucent foot steps on the solid grass, it hurts. And the character who's kind of his guide says reality is harsh to the feet of shadows. And the implication there is, as you move closer to the being of God, to his dwelling place, to his temple, to his heavenly city, to the New Jerusalem, you become more real. You become more fully human. You become the substantive thing he created you to be. The same image goes into the seventh book in the Narnia series as well. This further up, further in. And if you run away from him, you become a shadow of yourself. Right. This is the Lewis's kind of anthropology, what it means to be human. The closer you get to God, the more substantively human you are, and the further you get from God, the more the more shadowy you are, the less yourself you are. And so for him, hell isn't this place of, he's not thinking of the pit of the flaming pit of sulfur, burnt lake of sulfur kind of deal. It's people who are just completely consumed with themselves the whole time. And so everyone's generally grumpy because they wander around wondering why they don't have everything the way they want it. And so the movement is away from God is this inward curved shadow of fully human existence. And the closer you move to God, into his saving life, the more fully human you become, the more substantive you become, the more real you become. And it's really, that resonates deeply with me because it reframes salvation entirely. No longer is it, like you described, this kind of get in line, kid, right? That
Yep.
how many people, how many of your listeners probably like across the the West experience God as a parent basically smacking them on the back of the head, telling them to get in line, tuck in your shirt, tie your shoes, and because we got to go, get in line. Come on, hurry
Yep.
up,
Yeah.
right? When actually what you have is this God who loves you so much that he's willing to suffer himself for the consequences of your transgression. That's impressive to begin with. So you've transgressed my commands. I'm going to take the consequences you deserve on myself. That's how much I love you. And that will be and beyond that, I'm going to reform you into the glorious, beautiful creature you were always intended to be. This is why, again, with Lewis, in The Weight of Glory, he says, if you were ever to stand next to a human being unencumbered by sin, you'd be tempted to bow down and worship because a fully human being is a deeply beautiful and glorious creature. And so again, it's more human, more real, more substantive, more. I don't want to get. I don't want to more God-like, right? Not in the sense of being of becoming an uncreated thing, but in sharing the character of God.
Yeah. Yeah. This gets into a pretty complex thought, which I just want to mention. We can discuss it or not, but this idea of whether humans are essentially good, and that language is a little tricky.
Yeah.
Um, so I would not say that our condition is good or fundamentally good, but I would say when we use the words like essential or fundamental, we're referring to human nature rather than our condition. And I like how you said, uh, or how you wrote about uh, we don't need saved from a sinful human nature. Human nature is needing rescued from sin.
Yeah.
And that kind of leaves open this idea that we can talk about human nature as essentially good, and salvation and sanctification is more about restoring us to that good human nature.
Yeah, this is where it's very helpful to make a distinction between created goodness and salvific goodness, if I can put it that way, right? And this is interestingly some conversation in in the Global Methodist Church. We've had kind of some. I wrote this piece on doctrine of creation about several weeks ago, and got a little pushback in one spot, and the pushback came from kind of conflating these two, this idea of created goodness and salvific goodness. So here's what I mean. So God, a standard classic historical orthodox doctrine of creation says God made everything out of nothing. Everything God made is good, and God didn't have to make anything. Everything he made as a free expression of his love. So he if it exists and it's not God, he made it. Its existence is owed to him. Everything he makes is good. Everything he makes is contingent. It depends on him. God is the only non-contingent being. If something's contingent, it owes its existence to something else. So everything God made is contingent on him. God doesn't make evil matter. He doesn't make evil substances. He doesn't make evil anything. Evil is not a created substance. It's not something you could hold in your hand. It's a deprivation, a degradation, or a privation, or a corruption of a good thing that God has made. Even demons, right? If you're thinking like demonology, like we're created good in the first place, and then we're corrupted by rebellion. Human beings created good in the first place, and then corrupted by rebellion. And so I would say that human beings are part of God's good creation. the matter of our body, our substance, is good by virtue of being created by God. That's a different question than saying that we have any worth when it comes any meritorious worth with regard to salvation. Right. So I can't take my created goodness and hold it before Jesus and say, you owe me something. Right. So that's so when the Bible talks about all our works are as filthy rags, right? Our works are worth less. It's not saying that we have no worth by virtue of being created beings. It's saying that we have no worth that avails before God for salvation, right? And those are slightly different questions.
Yeah.
So, so I would want to say, I agree with you in the sense that to be a human being made in the image of God is a good thing. A human substance is part of God's good creation. Substance as a technical term for like what it is to be a thing. God has divine substance. We have human substance, right? But we have been corrupted, um, like I would affirm total depravity in the sense that every aspect of our humanity has been touched by and corrupted by the problem of sin.
Hmm.
So like my intellect is not untouched by sin, my emotions are not untouched by sin, my body is not untouched by sin. Um, my whole self is somehow corrupted in some way. Um, and so so another way to put it, drawing on William Burt Pope, 19th century Methodist theologian, he would say, you can list the constitutive elements, right? What are the elements that constitute a human being? You can list those out, and sin is not a constitutive element. Like sin is not a part of our constitution. We are not constituted sinners. We are not constituted by sin. It's an attack on our constitution. I don't know if that's a helpful way to put it, but
Yeah.
those are all ways to put that same basic idea. All that to say, sin is not essential to human nature. And if somebody wants to argue against that, then you don't have a savior.
Right. Yeah. 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 I liked how I wish I could remember exactly where William Burt Pope wrote it. But I'm paraphrasing him. I'll try to quote it as best as I can remember, but he said something along the lines of sin, whatever it is an accident to the nature that is
Yeah.
itself unchanged.
Yeah.
Something like that.
So that's the difference. We're talking about substance and accidents, right? These are Aristotelian categories. So substance is what a thing is, and the accidents are the properties of a thing, right? So I have properties like balding and used to be red hair and pale, things like that, blue eyes. And those are all like if I had brown eyes, I'd still be Matt O'Reilly, right? Those are like those features are accidental. Like when you're using the word accident in theology and philosophy, it doesn't mean like I accidentally dropped a hammer on my toe. Ouch, right? It is accidental properties are properties that are not essential to the nature of a thing, right? And so human beings all have different color hair. Your hair color is a property, but it's not part of your substance. So, and so when somebody like Pope says sin is accidental, what he's saying is it's not essential and it's not substantial. So that's the distinction. It is a we have the property of being sinners, but sin is not a part of our created substance, the what it is to be human.
Yeah. Yeah, I've phrased it this way sometimes. Let's see what you think about this. Um, I've defined it as nature is more of what we are, and then sinfulness is more of how we are. Or I could say that our created as a created being, um, I am good. Uh, or humanity is good, but the condition in which we're embodying that nature is sinful. Uh, so that when we say essential or fundamental, it's referring more to that, like what we are and how we were created, rather than like the condition which we're in.
Yeah, so I mean that's one of the reasons that I get worried about the language of sinful nature, honestly. And so in the New Testament, you'll get Paul's language of flesh, sarx in Greek. He'll talk about his flesh, and some translations, the NIV particularly does this, will translate that as sinful nature. And um, I worry about that because sometimes I think that that leads people to believe that their humanness is itself essentially sinful. So if by sinful nature you are attributing sin as an essential part of human substance, that's a problem. It's a huge problem because it's not true of Jesus, and Jesus defines what it means to be human. So I would want to say, I would be hesitant to say sinful nature and say human nature corrupted by sin, right? Because if I'm talking about having a sinful nature, then maybe I need to get free from my nature, right? And then you get salvation as this kind of like Gnostic escape from human, full human. Like you're then if your human nature is essentially sinful, you need to be saved from your nature. You don't need your you don't you know, and so then that denigrates human being, and sort of gets us into this sort of salvation as escape. But if my human nature is part of God's created good good creation, and it has been corrupted by the power of sin, by sin, and I'm complicit and captive to sin, then I don't need to get free from my humanity. I need my human nature to get free from sin. And that's what Jesus can. And Jesus took a human nature, not to free us from human nature, but to free our human nature from the alien power that is sin. Now,
Yeah.
that's not to sort of downplay sin. I would want to insist it's worse. It's worse than we think it is. It's way, like the corruption is horrible. But we don't need to be freed from our human being. Our human being needs to be free from sin.
Yeah. 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 I think that's just such a beautiful concept. And I've mentioned this already, but yeah, it, to me, it seems as if, salvation is about, uh, m m like becoming more fully me or more fully human, and it helps me embrace this idea that holiness is happiness, holiness is flourishing. It's not some burden or cross that I have to bear. Like this is where I find my greatest happiness,
That's right.
and that makes me think of you put out a video a while back on Paul and Romans, where you were talking about how Paul is often viewed as uh, the concept of grace is often emphasized here, and then uh, obedience is kind of a side thought. And what you had talked about was how Paul sort of bookends
Mm-hmm.
this concept of grace with obedience, and so that we're freed to obey. We become free to live this life. We're enabled to live this life of holiness, which is happiness. And I really appreciated that understanding of Paul.
Yeah, that's right. The idea there is in Romans, he begins in the kind of the introductory paragraph. He's called to be an apostle, set apart by Jesus, set apart by God to be an apostle of Jesus Christ, to bring about the obedience of faith among the nations, the Gentiles. So that's like part of his introduction of himself. And if you get, then you go to, I think it's somewhere in chapter 15. I don't have it right in front of me. He talks about his commission, his calling to bring about the obedience of faith among the Gentiles, the nations. And so it's kind of a standard principle in hermeneutics, biblical interpretation, that if you have the same idea bookending a text, and it could be, you know, a sub unit in a book, or it could be the book as a whole, that bookending theme governs the way you read the whole text, right? So obedience is not the obedience of the nations is not secondary to Paul's gospel. It is how he understands his vocation. And then justification in chapter 3 and 4 is instrumental in relation to procuring the obedience of the nations. And then that puts the real center of Romans in 6, 7, and 8, where he's dealing with um, Christology, freeing us from union with Christ, frees us from slavery to sin, and frees us to walk in the Spirit. 6, 7, 8, um, and then that becomes the means of obedience, right? So we're not obliged to obey sin; we are obliged to obey God. But again, obedience here is not this legalistic, like God's this cosmic killjoy up in the sky, and you want to go stay out past curfew, and He's like, "Be home by 10, kid," that kind of thing. It's God bringing you into union with his own being of perfect love, right? This is a piece. If I could say this, this answer's probably longer than it was supposed to be, but
No, it's good. That's good.
like I like to invite people to think about when we talk about divine love, perfect love, right? So try to imagine Father, Son, and Holy Spirit before anything was made. Eternal, everlasting, the before God had anything over which to stand as sovereign, before anything was made over which he was the sovereign creator, before he ever was judging sin, before any of that. Who is God? How do we define God in relation to himself, not in relation to his creator, right? Not in relation to us. So creator, judge, king, all of those define God in relation to me. He's my king, my creator, my judge. How do you define him in relation to himself? Father, Son, Spirit, the eternal relationships. God is always Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And how do you define the relationship between the Father, the Son, and the Spirit? It's Jesus describes it, the love that we had before the glory, the love that we had before the creation of the world. I want them to be a part of that, right? So you've got this eternal, perfect love, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Before anything is made, the Father loves the Son and the Spirit. The Son loves the Father and the Spirit loves the Father and the Son. And they love each other perfectly. They love each other infinitely. Like there's no deficiency in their love. There is no problem, no darkness, no aspect of it is withheld. It's not 99.9% love. It's thoroughgoing, infinite, perfect, divine love. And I take that to be the most beautiful thing there is. Whatever, what, whatever the eternal love that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit share amongst themselves in eternity is most beautiful. Holiness is an invitation to participate in that kind of love.
Yeah, yeah. In that video, you talked about how justification, Paul doesn't view justification as the ends or the end or the goal. It's the means to get to that life. And yeah, growing up, I feel like I viewed holiness as the means to get to salvation. The
Yeah,
end,
well said.
whereas the way that you're talking about it is no, salvation is the means to holiness,
Yeah.
and holiness is like it is the good life, it is the reward. Um,
Yeah. Man, that gets me thinking, right? Yeah. So if you move holiness into the means position, you get legalism
yep,
necessarily
yeah,
because you've got to be holy to be accepted.
yeah,
But that flips the order for Paul, for the whole Bible, right? You don't have to be holy to be accepted. You are accepted so you can become holy.
yeah,
And so justification is your acceptance, but and in biblical theology, justification is always instrumental. It is a means to another end. And it is the means to the end of the restoration of the image, to sanctification, to full sanctification, and ultimately resurrection of the body. I'll add this: holiness is related to future bodily resurrection, in that holiness is the rehumanizing of my inner self, and the bodily resurrection on the day of Christ comes is the rehumanizing of the rest of me, my bodily self, my outer self. That's how I think about it. So they're related that way. So holiness now points forward to the world that's coming, the world
yeah,
of resurrected bodies and a new creation, because it says, hey, here's what it looks like to be a new creature. Here's what it looks like to be renovated. And what God's doing for your character now, he's going to do for your body and the whole creation later. But if you move holiness into the instrumental role, where it becomes the means to the end of being accepted by God, then your life is going to be a mess. And it's going to be, you'll never, because you can't be holy enough to be accepted.
mhm. Yeah, yeah. That's so good. And flipping those around has just made holiness and sanctification just seem so attractive to me. So yeah, that leads us into the second question that you approach in the book. How holy can we expect to become in this life? How far in this process of restoration can we hope to become?
Yeah. So the way, as best I can tell, reading the Bible, the answer is thoroughly holy, through and through holy. Yeah, so the authors of the New Testament are not, they don't hesitate to use all encompassing language. when it comes to holiness. They never say, you never get this in the New Testament. You're only human, and just reconcile yourself to the fact that you're going to sin, right? The New Testament never says that. When the question of continuing sin is raised, like in Romans 6, for example, shall we continue in sin in order that grace may abound? Question gets raised twice, Romans 6:1 and 6:15, if memory serves. And in both answers, Paul's response is all caps, no, 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 right? I always like to say the me genoita, right? In Romans 6:1, may it never be. If you want to translate that into the 21st century tech world, like if he's texting you, it's in all caps. Like if you've ever been shouted at through a text message, that's Romans 6:1. Paul's like, no, absolutely not. Never, never, never. Jesus didn't save you so you could keep sinning. And I want to say, maybe Ben Witherington was one of my teachers, and I want to say he said it this way one time. He said, when the question of sin is raised in the New Testament, the answer is stop it right now. Like there's never a, hey, it's okay. You'll just struggle with it for a while because there's nothing you can do about it. The answer is quit. Stop being it. We have everything we need for life and godliness, the scriptures say. And so the answer is that if you're thinking about this as rehumanization, and if you're thinking of it not as in climbing a moral ladder, but as participation in perfect love, then the idea is the perfect love fills me up and pushes out the things that are not love. And so, yeah, that's why in the Wesleyan tradition, we're happy with language like entire sanctification and Christian perfection. Now, to reiterate, that isn't absolute perfection. It's not freedom from mistake. It's not freedom from ignorance. It's not freedom from non-moral imperfections. It's not free, and I think of things like when we talk about non-moral imperfections, I think about people who've experienced great trauma in their lives, right? Someone maybe who was abused as a child and carries those wounds with them into adulthood,
Mm.
right? That there is something that's out of order there. There's some imperfection. There's a wound, but it's not your fault, right? You're not morally culpable for what that person did to you. In the Wesleyan tradition, we would call that an infirmity, and we would insist it doesn't mean that you cannot participate in perfect love. What they did to you doesn't mean that you can't experience Christian perfection. You can carry the wound, but it doesn't mean you can't be loved by God. And so we're not saying this like static, nowhere, like finish line, nothing left to do. It's this God's love is poured into us in this expansive, thoroughgoing way. And I think about Romans 5, where sin abounded, grace superabounded. So like if I believe in total depravity, I ought to believe in entire sanctification.
Right.
Because if sin touches every part of me, am I going to say to the Lord Jesus Christ who offered his body for me that whatever he did on that cross can't touch everything that's wrong with me? It seems like an insult to the crucified Lord to me. So that's the thing. We have a robust doctrine of sin. But I have an even more expansive view of grace, that God's love can touch those wounded, dehumanized places.
Yeah, that raises some thoughts on the definition of sin. So I've been studying quite a bit into this debate between like a broader view of sin and the more
Yeah.
narrow view of sin. And Tom McCall, in his book Against God and Nature, sort of advocates for this broader view of sin, um, which includes the narrow view, but it also labels things beyond what Wesley would call like sin properly so called, where sin is defined as a willful and known transgression of God's law. So he kind of defines sin as in this broader sense. Um, and then, yeah, how would you approach that question when it comes to um, you know, being cleansed from all of our unrighteousness?
Yeah.
Um, in
Well, that's
which
the lang
context are we talking about there?
Yeah. So that's, I mean, that cleanse from all unrighteousness is Bible language. So the question is,
Right.
what does that mean? And I haven't read that passage in Tom's book lately, so I'd want to go back and review it to see what he says there. But I would agree with Wesley that like when we're talking about culpability, we're primarily talking about willful violation, willful transgression of a known law. But that doesn't necessarily capture every last possible sin, right? A sin of omission or something, or the whole like um, colleague I was chatting with yesterday on a podcast made the remark of like you walk around the corner and somebody like takes you by surprise or you run into them and you're like you say something you shouldn't say because they've it wasn't this sort of premeditated thing. All of that needs Jesus. I need to be saved from all of it. I need to be saved from the broadest definition of sin. I need to be saved from the narrowest definition of sin. I need to be saved from all sin. Everything in me that's not aligned with Jesus, it needs to be saved. That said, when we're talking about like this idea of entire sanctification, we tend to be thinking about the willful violation of the known law piece, right? So so the Lord grace is powerful enough. Grace is not just favor, it's power to transform me so that when I am tempted, um, the Spirit can enable me to be faithful.
Yeah.
And there's no temptation that is greater than the power of the Spirit of God.
Yeah, so that reminds me of Wesley, where he talks about being delivered from all sin, but he talks about it in this context of like willful and known sin, to where we're free to live according to this like law of love. And there's still like this broader context of sinfulness that sort of falls outside of our awareness or our intentions, where we still need the atoning work of Christ. And so he talks about
Yep.
praying for um, uh, forgiveness for these this broader view of sin. So yeah, I think that maybe that's some misunderstanding between some traditions that view sin in a more broad sense. They're kind of misunderstanding uh, whenever Methodists will talk about deliverance from
Yeah.
all sin.
Wesley would talk a lot about purity of intention,
Yeah.
right? But that doesn't mean there aren't other things out there that don't need atoning for, right? But again, that's his view of entire sanctification is very qualified and nuanced in that way.
Yeah. Um, so when we talk about this work of entire sanctification, um, is this something that um, like what it sounds to me often is that if I just try hard enough, then I can conquer all known and willful sin in my life. If I just work harder at this or strive harder at it, it seems like it's kind of like my work to do.
Yeah, I mean, I would take it completely the other direction and say that you don't have the capacity in yourself to do it at all. First Thessalonians 5, 23 and following, Paul prays for the entire sanctification of the Thessalonian believers. And then he punctuates that, may God himself sanctify you entirely. May your whole spirit, soul, and body be um, blameless at his coming. And then he says, the one who calls you is faithful, and he will do this. And so what I would often tell people is when they say that, like I've been trying, but I don't feel like I'm getting very far, is the answer isn't striving more, it's surrender. Because sanctification, just like justification, is by grace through faith. Like you can't earn your justification and you cannot earn your sanctification.
Mm.
You cannot justify yourself and you cannot sanctify yourself. Sanctification is the work of God through the presence of his Spirit within you to renew you and fill you with his perfect love. And so Wesley's answer to how do you get sanctified isn't try harder, it's wait in the means of grace. Um, like you can't sanctify yourself. So now that doesn't mean you just sort of run off and live like the devil or whatever, right? Waiting in the means of grace means you're worshiping with the church, you're searching the scriptures, you're meeting with your class or band meeting for serious accountability. You are a part of the community of believers, and you're in that space where God works graciously through his people in the power of the Spirit. And so it's not in the Wesleyan tradition, sanctification is not something you can successfully do. And the more you try that, the more like you will find you cannot sanctify yourself. And so you don't try harder to destroy to do these to strive more. You surrender and you wait for God to do what only He can do.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really helpful. It reminds me a lot of how Chris Bounds talks about it in the book he co-wrote with a few other guys on holiness, which I really enjoyed. Um, so this next question kind of goes beyond the book, and this might get into some pretty complex questions that uh, a, a short answer may not do what all we're wanting to do here. But I just at least want to ask this. Um, what what exactly happens in entire sanctification, and how do we know how can one know if they're entirely sanctified, and what's the biblical way that we can determine that? And is it like by process, or is it this instantaneous moment like crisis?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on all of that?
So I think of holiness both in terms of process and punctiliar momentary work, right? Um, somebody I forget where I heard this exactly, but think about when you're a kid, right? You're always growing, right? Eat your peas, you're always growing, imperceptibly so. And then some days you have a growth spurt and you wake up and all your pants are 4 inches too short, right? So you're always growing, and then some days you have a growth spurt. And so for the believer, we should always be growing in faith and growing in trust for, and growing in nearness to Jesus and drawing closer and closer to Him and cultivating, walking in the Spirit. And at the same time, along the way, there are crisis moments. Like there are moments where it seems like Jesus shows up and says, "Will you surrender to me now in this way completely?" Um, and so I would want to say I don't want to say sanctification is not a process, but I do want to say that there are times in our lives where like we have to decide whether we're going to withhold ourselves from Him or not. And I think you'll know if you're withholding yourself.
Yeah,
You'll know like if Jesus doesn't have your whole heart, you're going to know.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, so as we wrap up here, I just want to say how thankful I am um, that you wrote this book, that you took the time to talk to me today. I think the way that you present holiness and sanctification is, like I said, it's just so attractive and beautiful. And as someone who uh, I would identify myself as a seeker. I'm just not sure what I believe or what's true, and I'm sort of exploring things, exploring uh, the credibility of Christianity, you know, and uh, yeah, the way that you present it is just so beautiful. So thank you for um, the book and for talking to me today. And for the listeners, how else can people find you and your work?
Yeah, I've recently got into the Substack thing, and so I've kind of moved like my podcast is on Substack now, and that's where I'm writing. I try to publish twice a week, 2 articles a week, and 2 podcasts a month right now, which is I think probably manageable. So it's theologyproject dot substack.com. I think it may be. Let me check. Theologyprojectonline dot substack.com. And then, so that's kind of where my writing is, and that's kind of the main place. I have a website now, but it's really, I'm not writing actively on that anymore. MattO'Reilly.net. That's more of a placeholder there. You can, if somebody Googles, they'll find it. But everything links back to the Substack, and then there's a YouTube channel as well, but that's linked. So if folks go to that one spot, they'll be able to find everything.
Yeah, yeah, that's really helpful. I've really enjoyed all the content you have on YouTube and your different articles that you post. In addition to your books, I'm excited to read more of your books. This is the first one I've read so far. Yeah, really enjoyed talking to you.
Well, I've enjoyed it. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I really appreciate your posture, kind of the just transparency in your own story, where you are in life, and it's encouraging to me that I'm encouraged by the way you've engaged the material in Free to Be trust that the Lord will use that for His good purposes in your life.
All right. Well, Dr. O'Reilly, thank you so much.
Thanks, Joe.